It's the mid-1980s. I'm in Swaziland, African kingdom nestled between Mozambique and South Africa, today known as Eswatini. And I'm looking at a poster. It's a photograph of a man, bearded, sitting at a table, looking mournfully and evocatively into the middle distance. And he seems to have an answer to a question that I'm not quite aware of yet. I asked my teacher who it is. He smiles at me. You don't know? I was born in South Africa, and I lived there throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, during apartheid. Apartheid was a system of racialized oppression. It started in 1948, but in reality, several hundred years earlier, with the arrival of settlers in southern Africa. But I was a white person, a settler, an oppressor, a colonizer. I have vivid memories of those days. One comes to mind. A gardener had splattered mud of pot plants on the wall of someone's apartment. And the owner of the apartment, a young, angry-looking white man, grabbed the gardener, who was older than him, by the scruff of the neck and shunted him to the pot plants and proceeded to shout at him in front of me, a child. And I remember seeing the look of humiliation in the eyes of the gardener. And it made me sick, but I couldn't quite understand what it was, but I knew it was wrong. Even the privileged white children growing up under the system of apartheid felt the violence of that world. We were caned at school, corporal punishment. I was caned several times, and every time I was caned, I would cry. But it wasn't because of the physical pain. It was the humiliation. It was the fact that my dignity was being taken away, that there was something wrong about it, and no one seemed to be able to stop it. My mother was a beautiful woman, Dr. Jean Marquardt, and she was a feminist and also an activist against apartheid at a time when it wasn't fashionable to be so. I remember her taking me to a concert in a place called Orange Grove in Johannesburg. It was Johnny Clegg and his new band called Juluka, which means sweat in Zulu. He was a white man dressed in the regalia of Zulu dress with an African band. And I remember the thumping of the feet on the stage reverberating in my whole being. And I somehow knew that the beat of that drum was the true sound of Africa, a sound of emancipation, a sound of freedom, a sound of peace. Johnny Clegg represented interculturality. In a time of division, here was someone reaching across cultures to learn about the other. And he looked so happy, so swept up by this greater spirit that had overcome him. My life changed when I changed school. I went to a school in Swaziland, Eswatini, called Waterford Kamhlaba. Kamhlaba in Siswati means one world. This was a non-racial school and a school against apartheid. I rubbed shoulders with the children and the grandchildren of the great anti-apartheid leaders of the African National Congress. I had friends from all over Africa, from Uganda, from Zambia, from Tanzania, from Lesotho. I learned some Siswati, and we studied African literature, the works of Mongane Serote, of Elsa Joubert, of Sembene Usmani, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. At Waterford, I saw what freedom meant, and I saw what the true face of apartheid was, because we learnt the history of South Africa at Waterford, but a history you would never learn in South Africa. When I went back to South Africa for the holidays, that which had remained silent in my childlike imagination turned into a voice that was screaming out with the insanity of racism. And I could sense the sadness in the white population too, in the cynicism and the fear that they carried with them. As the great Egyptian leader, Anwar el-Sadat, said, "There's no happiness for people at the expense of other people." When I traveled Europe, people were surprised when they heard I was a white South African. I would never live in a place like South Africa. What you're doing in your country is wrong. I'm against apartheid. So was I, but I couldn't say it. because I embodied the outrage that they felt. I was the scapegoat. I was the white South African. I remember going up the Eiffel Tower. I was looking for friends. There was a group of Italian tourists, and we got on well until they found out where I came from. They pointed at me and chanted in unison, "Razzista, razzista." And yet in my heart, I felt African. But how could I, a privileged white South African, explain that I was also a victim, that apartheid had eaten something inside me too? I kept that to myself. My message is this: the violence of war and oppression and exploitation, it doesn't just take away the dignity of the oppressed, it strips the oppressors of their humanity. Oppression oppresses everybody, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's not just about a feeling of guilt. Systems of oppression force people to say things and do things that take away their humanity. One of the reasons why I left South Africa to go to school in Swaziland was to avoid being drafted into the army. Because in those days, if you went to the army, you'd wind up in a tank with a rifle, driving through the townships, shooting at people. I'm a head of school. I'm an educator. What is my message for peace? It's first to never let the bigotry, the prejudice, the ugliness of war enter the classroom. Schools must be places where friendships can be free of the quarrels that happen outside that sacred space of the human spirit. The second is to hearken to the voice and not to the category, to listen to the story and not to judge by the label, to let people express themselves for who they really are. We're much more than the passports we carry, and we don't represent the political decisions that are taken by those who represent those passports that we carry. And lastly, we have to know each other's histories. We have to know each other's cultures. We have to understand the complex, intertwined geopolitics of where we come from. Because we can't build anything if we're ignorant of that. The man in the photograph, bearded, staring into the middle distance, seemed to be looking at me. My teacher told me, this is Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years of his life in prison and would become our president. I'd never seen him. People like me had never seen a photograph of Nelson Mandela because he was what was called under apartheid a banned person. Images of Nelson Mandela were banned. And that's because it's easier to hate someone that you don't know. And the question I had for him, which I now understand, was, how can you lead us out of this darkness, out of this fear? And his answer, what he showed us with his life. First, knowledge and understanding. No peace will be built on ignorance. Secondly, to give oxygen to the breath of the human spirit. And thirdly, love. To teach for love. Because if we truly know each other, if we truly understand each other's cultures, we'll see that there's so much to love, not to hate, to love. With love comes light. With love, there will be togetherness. And with love, there will be peace. Thank you.